She didn't want justice. She wanted revenge. That was the phrase whispered in every saloon from Abilene to Tombstone. Before the name, the Widow of Winchester, became legend, she was just Eleanor McGraw, wife of a modest cattle rancher, cook of peach pies, and Sunday school teacher in the frontier town of Dry Creek, New Mexico. On June 2nd, 1887, the sun rose red as rust. At dusk, her husband's body was found face down in the dust, riddled with bullets, the herd missing, and no witnesses brave enough to speak out. But what no one knew was that Eleanor had buried more than her husband that day. She buried who she used to be. Dry Creek was a lawless village between mountain and desert, caught in the brutal transition between frontier justice and federal law. The sheriff's badge was worn by a drunk with one good eye and no real power. Cattle rustlers ruled the hills, and westbound trains were often stopped by masked men with loaded Colts and dead eyes. Eleanor had always feared this growing darkness, but never thought it would knock on her door. The gang that killed her husband left no trace, or so they thought. But Eleanor wasn't looking for legal justice. She studied her husband's wounds as if they were scriptures, rode into the hills where the vultures circled, and began to ask questions. A storm was brewing behind her eyes, and she carried the sound of gunfire. She sold the ranch for half its value and used the money to buy a Winchester rifle, a Colt 45, and 3 weeks of shooting lessons with an old buffalo hunter who owed her husband a favor. By day, she practiced. At night, she carved the names she heard whispered into a leather notebook. Jed Rourke, Silas Grant, Billy Quaid. She learned to read trails, follow footprints along streams, and understand the language of silence, the kind of silence that comes before someone dies. The men who killed her husband were still out there, and they had no idea she was coming. They killed a cattle farmer, but they created a legend. In the fall, Eleanor rode alone, dressed in black, known only by her new name, the Widow of Winchester. She found Billy Quaid first, drunk and bragging in a brothel in Santa Fe. She didn't wait for him to draw. A clean shot to the eye. The bartender said she didn't blink. The locals started whispering. A ghost with a rifle. A woman despised by God and sharpened by pain. She headed west towards the old railroad lines that bled into Arizona. With each name crossed off her list, she got closer to the man who pulled the trigger on her husband. But revenge comes at a price, and Eleanor paid with pieces of her soul. She had once been a wife, a housewife, a woman of peace. Now she was becoming something else. In a territory where lawmen were outnumbered and outgunned, Eleanor McGraw forced West to look in the mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. Her story spread not because it was violent, but because it was clear. She wasn't fighting for gold, land, or glory. She was fighting for something older than the law and deeper than justice: memory. Some women waited at the graves, others reached for their guns. Eleanor chose the rifle. A train to nowhere. You don't stop a train by standing on the tracks, you derail it. That was the widow's new philosophy. After Billy Quaid's death, the noose was tightening on the remaining men. The news spread fast, too fast. Jed Rourke and Silas Grant had disappeared, avoiding the bigger cities and hiding among gangs from Colorado to Nevada. But Eleanor wasn't chasing men. She chased patterns, and she knew that wolves always returned to the place of their slaughter. That's when she heard about the Fort Yuma Express, a monthly train that transported cattle smuggled between the territories illegally branded, freshly stolen. It wasn't just a train, it was an artery. And Eleanor was ready to cut it. September 17th, 1887. Eleanor bought a ticket under the name Mrs. Grace Holloway and boarded the Fort Yuma Express just after sunset. It was a long steel beast crawling across the moonlit desert, laden with boxes, cattle, and secrets. She wore a dark green dress, a derringer attached to her garter, and a double-barrel shotgun hidden in her luggage. The driver smiled. She nodded back, already counting exits and watching every pair of boots that passed down the aisle. The train was moving, but so was the trap. Halfway down the second carriage, Eleanor saw him. Silas Grant. Dirty hat, crooked moustache, and nervous fingers that sent shivers down her spine. He didn't recognize her. How could he? The last time he saw her, she was screaming in the dirt next to her husband's body. Now she was composed, coiled like a rattlesnake under silk. She followed him silently to the freight car. No witnesses, just hay, rust, and shadows. What came next would echo louder than any bullet. "Silas," she said, calm, cold, like death wearing perfume. He turned, confused, then terrified. He reached for his belt, but Eleanor was quicker. The first shot hit his thigh. The second, his shoulder. She hadn't killed him? Not yet. She wanted answers. Who had led the attack? Who pulled the trigger on her husband? And most importantly, where was Jed Rourke? Silas spat blood and lies, but one name kept coming up. The Black Spur Gang. A gang Eleanor knew only from outlaw myths, and every myth has its roots in something real. She left Silas bleeding, tied to the axle of the freight car. When the train stopped in Yuma, she got off unnoticed, disappearing into the dust. When they found him, he was half dead, muttering his name like a curse. She rode west again, towards the border towns where the Black Spur Gang operated. The law was hunting her now. She wasn't just a grieving widow, she was a vigilante, a killer. Some newspapers called her an avenger, others a menace. But Eleanor didn't care what the world thought. Her war wasn't against the law. It was against the silence that follows a scream. Every man she hunted was another link in the chain that strangled her past. She no longer prayed at night. Instead, she cleaned her guns, whispered her husband's name, and memorized wanted posters by lamplight. Her notebook was almost full, and on the last page there was a single name: Jed Rourke. The man who gave the order, the man she would find, the man who would understand the true meaning of revenge. Because justice wears a badge, but revenge wears a veil. The Black Spurs. Some demons wear black hats, others wear black spurs. In the world of outlaws, the Black Spur Gang wasn't just a name. It was a horror story told in whispers around the campfire. They didn't just steal cattle, they wiped out entire families. Entire settlements disappeared after their attacks. The gang had no fixed camp, no predictable pattern, and no mercy. Eleanor spent weeks riding alone through hostile territory, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Most looked away when she mentioned the Black Spurs. Others warned her, begged her to give up. But Eleanor wasn't looking for survival. She was looking for Jed Rourke. And where his trail ended, so would hers. One way or another. October 3rd, 1887. In the heart of Arizona Territory, Eleanor found a town that didn't appear on any map. Bitter Pass. It was more of a trading post than a town. 6 shacks, a salon, and a crooked gallows that looked like it had been used recently. The barman's hands were shaking when she asked about the Black Spurs. "They come once a month," he whispered. "They pay with silver. They leave blood behind." He leaned closer. "Next time, they'll come for a shipment from the old silver mine to the north." That was all she needed to know. If they were coming to Bitter Pass, she would be waiting. For 5 days, Eleanor prepared like a preacher for doomsday. She inspected the mine, studied every rise and cave, set traps with the precision of a surgeon. He no longer wore a dress, just leather and dust, his rifle always by his side. When the Spurs arrived, there were 6 of them, including a huge man on a pale horse that matched Jed Rourke's description. Eleanor's pulse didn't quicken. Her grief had hardened into something sharper than fear. The hunters had become prey, and they didn't know it yet. The first explosion came at dawn. A tripwire set off a box of dynamite, throwing 2 horses and an outlaw into the air. The remaining Spurs scattered, but Eleanor hunted them down like wolves in a valley. One by one they fell, some by the rifle, others by the traps. By midday, only one remained, Jed Rourke. He was trapped inside the mine, coughing up blood and swearing revenge. Eleanor entered the tunnel with her lamp up and her rifle steady. He looked at her and laughed. "I didn't kill your husband," he said. "I only gave the order." She stared at him, silent. "That makes it easier," he replied, and pulled the trigger. And at that moment, the past reached the present in a single shot. Outside the mine, silence returned. The town of Bitter Pass never talked about what happened that day, but legends began to swirl like desert winds. A woman in black, a rifle with carved initials, a blood-soaked mine. Eleanor buried her weapons under a Joshua tree that night. Her notebook, now complete, she burned in the fire. And when the sun rose, she rode on, not as a widow, not as a gunfighter, but as someone reborn from the ashes. Because revenge doesn't bring peace, but sometimes it buries ghosts. Wanted by God and man. She thought she was hunting wolves. She discovered she was becoming one. With Jed Rourke dead, his last name crossed out of her notebook, Eleanor McGraw should have found peace. But legends don't rest, they wander. And the stories being told about the widow of Winchester began to outstrip the truth. In all the territories west of the Mississippi, wanted posters with her face on them sprang up like wildfire. Murder, revenge, disruption of federal justice. For the government, she was no longer a grieving widow. She was a threat to law and order. The West had crowned her queen of vengeance. Now it wanted her head. The Pinkertons were the first to show up. Men in grey suits, sharp eyes and cold hearts. They weren't looking for justice. They were looking to send a message. A woman who made the law look weak couldn't ride free. They followed her to Carson Bluff, where she had taken refuge in a church mission run by old nuns from the frontier. Eleanor tended to the wounded, exchanging her rifle for prayer. But justice, true justice, has a long memory, and the past always knocks at the door, even of chapels. They came at dawn, without warning, no trial, just smoke, boots, and a handful of warrants. Eleanor didn't run, but she didn't surrender either. She hid behind the chapel wall, fighting back only when necessary. The nuns shouted her name. Bullets tore through pews and Bibles. A Pinkerton agent fell. Another was wounded. In the end, she escaped across the desert under the cover of night, bleeding on the shoulder, her soul increasingly broken. She had already buried her husband. Now she was burying herself. Alone again, Eleanor wandered south, near the Mexican border, taking refuge among outcasts, runaway slaves, exiled tribal scouts, widows who had lost more than names. Among them, she wasn't the widow of Winchester. She was just Ellie, a woman with haunted eyes and a scar below her collarbone. One night, a boy asked her if she was the same woman from the cheap novels. She nodded. "Was it worth it?" he asked. She hesitated. "I'm still alive," she said, "but living is not the same as healing." That winter, Eleanor found herself face to face with U.S. Marshal Reuben Stokes, a black lawman from Louisiana who made his name capturing gunmen and war criminals. But he didn't come to kill her. He came to talk. "You're not the first person to bury someone and think a bullet will bring them back," he said. "But you could be the first person to make hell look like a wedding dress." They talked for hours about the law, about loss, about what's left after revenge. He offered her a deal: disappear forever or face trial and tell her story. She looked at the horizon. Some stories don't belong in court. They belong in the graves. Eleanor McGraw's last ride. They called her the Widow, but the West knew her as something else. The Last Judgment. If this journey through the Wild West had you hooked until the end, if you found yourself cheering, or even holding your breath, then comment below. The legend continues. Eleanor McGraw had become more myth than woman. In the mining camps, her story was told as scripture. In the salons, they raised glasses to her name. Some called her a ghost. Others called her a saint with a rifle. But in truth, Eleanor was tired. The dust, the blood, the silence, they weighed more than any saddlebag. Revenge had served its purpose. It had answered the cry inside her chest. But it hadn't cured it. And what do you become after the fire has burned everything? She rode alone through the Mojave, hunting no man, running from no badge. Marshal Reuben Stokes had kept his word. He'd let her go, not because she deserved it, but because he understood something deeper. The law can only punish what it understands. And Eleanor was something the law could not measure. All she carried in her saddle was a Bible, a reliquary with her husband's hair, and a Winchester rifle with no bullets. She didn't ride to kill. She rode to disappear. High in the mountains of Nevada, above an abandoned mining town called Redemption Gap, Eleanor found an old house. Abandoned. Silent. A chimney still standing, like a tombstone to another life. She fixed the roof, patched the door, and planted wildflowers. No one came, no one dared. For 3 years she lived there. She grew tomatoes. She took in orphan chicks. Her hands, once calloused by gunpowder, became calloused by the earth. They said she died there. Others said she became a healer, tending to wounded travelers. The West has lost many things, but not her memory. A woman in black seen riding through abandoned towns, leaving coins on widows' doors, helping lost children find their way home. Some said she was a spirit. Others believed she had finally found peace. But the truth? She wasn't justice. She wasn't revenge. She was Eleanor McGraw. The end.